Imagine you are holding a wooden box. It is roughly the size of a large piece of carry-on luggage. It is covered in pure gold. There is nothing mechanical about it. No circuits, no wiring, no moving parts. Just wood and gold. And yet, this box killed 2 men the moment they touched it without permission. It devastated 5 cities with a plague so violent that the people begged to give it away. It stopped a flooding river in its tracks the instant a priest's foot touched the water. It brought down the walls of the most fortified city in the ancient world without a single sword swing. And 70 men from a single village died simply for opening the lid and looking inside. Not one of those events required an army. Not one required a weapon. One box, no mechanism, no guard. And more destruction, more fear, and more reverence than any object in the history of human civilization. This is the Ark of the Covenant. And if you think you already know this story, I promise you, you do not. Because the real story of the Ark is not just about miracles. It is about what those miracles reveal. About what was inside that box. About what was above it. And about why, at a moment no one can explain, the most powerful object to ever exist on the face of the earth simply vanished. No record of where it went. No farewell, no funeral. Just gone. For the next 40 minutes, we're going to follow the Ark from the moment it was designed to the moment it disappeared. And then beyond, into the theories, the searches, the obsessions. And the question that 3 religions and billions of people are still trying to answer. Where is the Ark of the Covenant? And what would happen if someone actually found it? To understand what the Ark was, you need to go back to the exact moment it was conceived. And the first thing you need to know is that it was not Moses' idea. It was not the suggestion of any priest or architect. The design came directly from God. And the level of detail in that design is in itself extraordinary. We are in the Sinai Desert, approximately 1446 BC. The people of Israel have just escaped Egypt after 4 centuries of slavery. Hundreds of thousands of people are camped in the middle of absolute nothing. Sand, rock, and a sun that shows no mercy. Moses climbs Mount Sinai and stays there for 40 days and 40 nights. No food, no water. Alone on a peak that the text describes as consumed by fire, wrapped in a cloud so thick it shook the entire mountain with thunder and lightning. The people camped below trembled at the sound, and it is in that setting that God gives Moses the specifications for the Ark. Pay close attention to what those specifications reveal, because most people have never noticed what is hidden inside the details. God does not speak in vague terms. He does not say, "Build something beautiful and sacred." He specifies every dimension, every material, every design choice. The Ark was to be built from acacia wood. Not just any wood, acacia specifically, one of the only trees that grows in the Sinai Desert. The dimensions, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 wide, and 1.5 high. In modern measurements, roughly 3 feet 9 inches long by 2 feet 3 inches wide by 2 feet 3 inches tall. A box that would fit inside the trunk of a car. But this box was to be covered in pure gold. Every surface, inside and out, covered in beaten gold. A gold molding ran along the upper edge. The Hebrew word for that molding is zer, which means crown. The Ark had a crown. And on its sides, 4 rings of cast gold, 2 on each side, through which carrying poles of acacia wood, also covered in gold, would be inserted. And here's the detail that most people skip right past. The poles were never to be removed. Never. They were to remain in the rings permanently. Think about what that means. If the Ark was meant to rest in a sacred place, first in the tabernacle, then eventually in the temple, why keep the transport poles locked in at all times? It is like buying a house and never unloading the moving truck. Unless the point is that the ark was always ready to go, always prepared to move, as if God were declaring from the very first moment, I do not stay still. I go where my people go, and when I decide to move, there will be no time to prepare. But the most important component of the ark was not the box. It was the lid. The Hebrew word for it is kaparet. English translations call it the mercy seat. But the root of the word, kafar, means to cover, to atone, to make reconciliation. This lid was not decoration. It was the place in the universe where justice and mercy met, the precise point where God's demand for holiness and God's willingness to forgive touched each other. And on top of this lid stood two figures that have fascinated scholars for centuries: the cherubim. Two cherubim of solid gold, not gold beaten over a wooden frame like the rest of the ark. Pure cast gold, hammered from a single piece of metal along with the lid itself. The cherubim and the mercy seat were one object, born from the same mass of gold. Their wings stretched upward, arching over the mercy seat, their faces turned toward each other, looking down toward the lid. And it is exactly in the space between those two golden figures that God says something that should stop every reader cold. There I will meet with you. There I will speak to you. From above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that rest upon the ark. Read that again slowly. The God who created the universe, who cannot be contained by the highest heavens, just gave a mailing address, a precise, physical, locatable point in space, between two gold sculptures on the lid of a wooden box in the middle of a desert. That is where I will be. That is where I will speak. The Ark of the Covenant was not a symbol. It was not a religious prop. It was not a ritual object like those found in every other religion of the ancient world. According to the text, it was the earthly throne of God, the contact point between heaven and earth, mobile, portable, and more dangerous than anything that had ever existed. Before we follow the ark on its journeys, we need to talk about what was inside it, because the contents are as revealing as the container itself. The Bible records 3 objects kept inside the ark. 3. And each one carries a meaning that most people have never properly understood. The first and most well-known are the tablets of the law, the 2 stone slabs on which God inscribed the 10 Commandments. But here is something most people do not know. These were not the original tablets. The first set, written by the very finger of God, according to the text, were destroyed. When Moses came down from the mountain and saw the people worshipping a golden calf, he threw the tablets to the ground in rage. They shattered. God had to write them a second time. What this means is staggering. Inside the most sacred object in the universe, there was physical proof that the people had already broken the covenant before it had even properly begun. The second object was a jar of manna, that supernatural food that fell from the sky every morning in the desert, white and fine, tasting like honey wafers. Manna spoiled within 1 day. If anyone kept it overnight, they found a pot full of worms the next morning. Except the jar inside the ark. The manna inside never spoiled. Whatever existed in the space between those cherubim, it altered the laws of organic decay. The third object was the strangest of all, Aaron's rod, a dry, dead staff cut from an almond tree. When a rebellion broke out and people challenged Aaron's authority as high priest, God commanded each tribe to bring a staff and place them all before the ark overnight. The next morning, 11 staffs were still dry and lifeless. Aaron's had sprouted. It had blossomed. It had produced ripe almonds. Overnight. Dead wood bearing living fruit. 3 objects. The broken law, a permanent reminder of human failure. The preserved manna, a permanent reminder of divine provision. The rod that came back to life, a permanent reminder that God chooses whom he chooses, and that death does not get the final word. All of it sealed inside a box no one could open, covered by a lid called the Place of Forgiveness, watched over by two golden angels looking down. If a human mind designed this, it was the most brilliant symbolic architecture in the history of religion. If God designed it, every inch was a message that would take centuries to be fully decoded. Section 4. The Ark is built. The Ark was built by a man named Bezalel. God called him by name. He is one of the very few craftsmen in the entire Bible whom God personally identifies and equips. The text says God filled him with his spirit, with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge in every kind of craft. Bezalel was not merely a talented carpenter. He received, according to the text, a supernatural capacity to work gold, silver, bronze, precious stones, and wood. Imagine the hands of this man, shaping gold in the Sinai sun, hammering the cherubim millimeter by millimeter, knowing that what he was building would be inhabited by the living God. When the ark was completed and placed inside the tabernacle for the first time, something happened that left Moses speechless. A cloud descended and covered the tent, and the glory of God filled the tabernacle so completely, so overwhelmingly, that Moses, the same man who had spent 40 days in God's presence on the mountaintop, could not enter. The presence was too dense, too heavy, too real. From that moment forward, the ark became the absolute center of everything. The 12 tribes of Israel camped in formation around the tabernacle where it rested. When the cloud above the tabernacle lifted, the people disassembled everything and marched. When the cloud stopped moving, the people stopped. The ark dictated when they slept, when they rose, where they traveled, and when they halted. One object directed the life of an entire nation. And during the marches, the ark traveled ahead of the people, carried by Levite priests, at a distance of about a 3-day journey in front of the rest. 3 days ahead, the ark went first, alone, clearing the way, facing whatever lay ahead before the people ever arrived. Moses died in the desert. Joshua took command. And the first impossible task he faced was standing on the east bank of the Jordan River, staring at the city of Jericho on the other side. The problem? It was harvest season, the one time of year when the Jordan floods. A river that was normally a few meters wide had become a wide, swift-moving current, impossible to cross, with hundreds of thousands of people, children, the elderly, animals, and supplies. God's instruction was precise. The priests carrying the ark were to step into the water first. Not the army, not the scouts, the priests with the ark. And the people were to follow, at a distance of about 900 meters behind. Because, in the words of Joshua chapter 3, you have not passed this way before. The ark went first, always first. The moment the priest's feet touched the edge of the water, the river stopped. The waters coming from upstream piled up in a heap far away near a city called Adam. The waters flowing toward the Dead Sea were cut off completely. The riverbed dried out. And the priest stood still, with the ark in the middle of the dry Jordan, while an entire nation crossed on solid ground. And the moment the priest carrying the ark stepped onto the far bank, the river returned. Not gradually, not in minutes, immediately. The Jordan flooded again as before, the instant their feet left the riverbed. The precision of what happened is what is most remarkable. It was not a seasonal anomaly. It was not a geological coincidence. It was timed to the footsteps of the priests carrying the ark. With the people now on the other side of the Jordan, the ark faced its first war. And the way that war unfolded defies every principle of military logic ever recorded. Jericho, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Walls documented by archaeologists as being up to 12 feet thick in some sections. Estimated height of 15 to 25 feet, surrounded by an outer ditch, a city built to be impregnable. Joshua had no siege engines, no catapults, no ladders tall enough. By any rational military analysis, taking Jericho without siege equipment was impossible. And the strategy God gave Joshua sounded, frankly, like a joke. March around the city once a day for 6 days, in total silence. No shouting, no attacking, no threats, just march. The ark at the center of the procession, carried by priests. 7 priests blowing trumpets of ram's horn walking before it. On the 7th day, march around 7 times, and at the end of the 7th lap, when the trumpets sound, the people shout. Imagine watching this from inside Jericho. From the top of the walls, day after day, you watch an entire army walking in circles in complete silence, carrying a golden box. Not attacking, not speaking, just walking. The psychological weight of that silence must have been unbearable. On the 7th day, on the 7th lap, the trumpet sounded and the people shouted, and the walls collapsed. The Hebrew text says they fell down flat, literally beneath themselves. The wall did not fall outward. It did not fall inward. It fell straight down onto its own foundations. Archaeologist John Garstang in 1930 and Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s both found something extraordinary when they excavated the site of ancient Jericho. Bricks fallen at the base of the wall, forming a ramp of rubble on the outside. Exactly what you would find if a wall collapsed downward and outward simultaneously. A ramp that soldiers could climb directly into the city. And Joshua records that every soldier entered from the nearest point. The collapse was not localized. It was total and simultaneous, around the entire perimeter. The ark was not a weapon. It was something more dangerous than any weapon. It was a declaration. The God who lives between the cherubim does not need armies. He needs obedience. But if Jericho showed what happened when Israel obeyed, what came next showed what happened when they did not. And this is where the story of the ark stops being awe-inspiring and starts being terrifying. Because the same presence that stopped a river and collapsed a city began to turn against the very people it was supposed to protect. The next city after Jericho was Ai, small, insignificant. Joshua's spies came back and said 2,000 or 3,000 men would be more than enough. Total confidence. They had just watched walls fall with a shout. What could a small town do? 3,000 soldiers went up, and they fled. 36 Israelite soldiers died. A small number in absolute terms, but the effect on the people was seismic. Joshua chapter 7 says the hearts of the people melted and became like water. It was not about the 36 dead. It was about what those deaths meant. Something between Israel and the ark had broken. Joshua tore his clothes, fell face down before the ark, and stayed there until evening. And God answered with a sentence that is as chilling as anything in the Bible. Israel has sinned. One man, a soldier named Achan, had secretly stolen part of the plunder of Jericho, a beautiful Babylonian robe, 200 pieces of silver, and a bar of gold. He had buried them under his tent. One man, one hidden act, and because of it, the ark did not protect. 36 men died because a single individual believed he could conceal something from the God who dwelt between the cherubim. Achan was identified, confronted, and the punishment was total. His sons, his daughters, his livestock, his tent, and everything he owned were taken out, stoned, and burned. Then covered with a heap of stones. Achan was not just punished, he was erased. And only after that, only after the hidden sin was removed, did God say to Joshua, "Now go up against Ai." Ai fell. The lesson could not have been clearer. The ark was not a machine that operated automatically. It was not a talisman that worked regardless of the character of the people around it. The ark amplified everything. Obedience in the presence of the ark produced extraordinary power. Sin in the presence of the ark produced catastrophic consequence. And the ark made no distinction between enemy and ally. It simply reflected the reality of the relationship between God and the people, perfectly, ruthlessly, without exception. The most dramatic episode in the entire history of the ark begins around 1104 BC. Israel is at war with the Philistines, who occupied the coastal region of what is now the Gaza Strip. They said, "Why has God let us be defeated today?" And the answer they landed on was, "Let us bring the ark from Shiloh." Not, "Let us ask God what we have done wrong." Not, "Let us repent." Not, "Let us consult a prophet." Just, "Bring the box." As if the power were in the object itself, rather than in the God who dwelt above it. The ark arrived at the Israelite camp, carried by the two sons of the high priest Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. And the text has already told us, in explicit terms, exactly what kind of men these were. 1 Samuel says they were wicked men who did not know the Lord. They stole the offerings brought to the tabernacle. They slept with the women who served at the entrance. These were the men now carrying the Ark of the Covenant into battle. When the ark entered the camp, the people shouted so loudly that the ground shook. The Philistines on the other side heard it and asked what was happening. When they learned the ark of the God of Israel had arrived, they were afraid. 1 Samuel records their exact words. "Woe to us! Who will save us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck Egypt with every kind of plague." The Philistines knew the reputation of the ark. The terror was real. But then their commanders did something unexpected. Instead of retreating, they told their men to be strong, fight harder, do not become slaves to the Hebrews. They attacked. The result was catastrophic for Israel. 30,000 infantry soldiers killed, Hophni and Phinehas both dead. And the unthinkable happened. The Ark of the Covenant was captured, taken as a war trophy by the Philistines. A messenger ran to Shiloh, his clothes torn, dirt on his head. The high priest Eli, 98 years old and blind, sat waiting by the gate. The messenger reported 4 things. Israel has fled. Many have died. Your 2 sons are dead. And the ark of God has been taken. The text records that the instant Eli heard the mention of the ark, he fell backward from his chair, broke his neck, and died. Not the defeat, not the death of his sons. It was the ark. And Phinehas's wife, pregnant, heard the news and went into labor immediately. She gave birth to a son. With her last breath, she named him Ichabod, which means, "The glory has departed from Israel." And she died. The ark was now in enemy hands. The Philistines carried the ark in triumph to the city of Ashdod. They did what victorious armies always did with captured religious objects. They placed it inside the temple of their chief god, Dagon, right beside the statue of Dagon. A statement. Our God defeated their God. The next morning, the priests of Dagon entered the temple and found the statue face down on the floor before the ark, flat on the ground, as if in a posture of worship. They picked it up and set it back in its place. The next morning, Dagon was on the floor again. But this time, 1 Samuel records a detail that belongs in a horror story. Dagon's head and both his hands had been cut off, severed at the wrists and the neck, lying on the threshold of the temple. Only the torso remained. The god of the Philistines had been decapitated and dismembered during the night in his own temple before a golden box. And then the destruction spread beyond the idol. The people of Ashdod began to be struck with tumors, a violent epidemic, swift and devastating. And the Greek version of the text adds a detail that many translations omit. Rats. A massive infestation of rats swept through the land, destroying the crops. Tumors and rats. To a modern epidemiologist, that combination is instantly recognizable. Those are the hallmark signs of bubonic plague. The bacterium that causes plague is transmitted by fleas living on rodents. It produces painful swellings in the lymph nodes, exactly what the text describes. If this identification is correct, the ark brought upon the Philistines the same disease that would devastate Europe 3,000 years later in the Black Death. The people of Ashdod made a decision quickly. This cannot stay here. They sent the ark to the city of Gath. The plague followed. Gath sent it to Ekron. When the people of Ekron saw the cart arriving, the text says they cried out in terror. They have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us, to kill us and our people. The ark had been in Philistia for 7 months. 7 months of systematic, city-by-city destruction. And every Philistine leader wanted it gone. The Philistine leaders summoned their priests and diviners and asked the only question that mattered. What do we do with the ark of the God of Israel? The answer the priests gave reveals, in remarkable detail, the depth of their suffering. Do not send it back empty. Send a guilt offering with it. 5 golden tumors and 5 golden rats, 1 for each of the 5 major Philistine cities. Gold replicas of the exact afflictions that had devastated them. It is a confession cast in precious metal. A pagan people acknowledging through their own religious categories that they had made a catastrophic error. But the Philistine priests added one more element, a test. Take 2 cows that are nursing their calves and have never been yoked. Hitch them to a new cart. Put the ark on the cart. Separate the cows from their calves and release them without a driver. If they go toward Israelite territory, toward Beth Shemesh, then it was the God of Israel who did all this to us. If they turn away and go anywhere else, it was just a coincidence. Think about how carefully this test was designed. Cows that have never pulled a cart would have no idea what to do. And nursing cows, freshly separated from their calves, would have one overwhelming instinct: go back to their young. Every farmer knows this. The test was engineered to fail. 1 Samuel records what happened. The cows took the straight road to Beth Shemesh. They did not turn to the right or to the left. They walked lowing as they went, calling out for the calves they had left behind, fighting every animal instinct in their bodies. And they did not stop. They walked in a straight line into Israelite territory and stopped in a wheat field. The Philistine rulers followed to the border and watched. Then they turned and went back. The ark had returned. The men of Beth Shemesh were harvesting wheat when they looked up and saw the cart approaching. They rejoiced. They took the cart apart for wood and sacrificed the cows as an offering, right there on a large stone in the field. Everything should have been fine. But then the men of Beth Shemesh made a fatal mistake. They opened the lid of the ark. They looked inside. The text does not explain why. Curiosity, disrespect, disbelief. The reason is not recorded. Only the result. God struck the men of Beth Shemesh. The number in the Hebrew text is debated by scholars, with some ancient sources recording 70 and others recording a far larger figure. But even at 70, the impact was total. An entire community decimated for looking into a box. The reaction of the survivors is the most human response imaginable. Who is able to stand before this holy God? Where can we send it so it leaves us? The same reaction as the Philistines, the same terror. The same desperate desire to put distance between themselves and this object. The ark made no distinction between enemy and friend. The Philistine who placed it next to a pagan idol suffered. The Israelite who looked inside suffered. The corrupt priest who carried it into battle died. The ark was not partial. The ark was holy. And holiness, in its original biblical meaning, does not mean gentle goodness. It means absolute separation. A standard that does not negotiate, does not bend, and does not excuse carelessness. The men of Beth Shemesh sent word to Kiriath Jearim, "Come, take it. We do not want it here." Kiriath Jearim accepted the ark. It was taken to the house of a man named Abinadab on a hill. His son Eleazar was consecrated to guard it. And for 20 years the ark sat in silence in a private house on a hill in a secondary city. No temple, no ceremony, no procession. Just a guarded room and a man whose entire life had become, "Do not let anyone touch it." The man who finally became obsessed with bringing the ark back to the center of Israel's life was David. He loved the ark with what the text makes clear was an almost irrational devotion. He would dance in the streets before it, half-clothed, sweating, in front of the entire nation, and not care what anyone thought. But the first time David tried to bring the ark to Jerusalem, something went terribly wrong. David gathered 30,000 chosen men. 30,000. This was not a logistics operation. This was a national event. The ark would travel from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem, to the city of David, to the heart of the kingdom. They placed the ark on a new cart, built specifically for the occasion. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, who had grown up in the same house as the ark, guided the cart. David and the whole assembly played instruments before it: harps, lyres, tambourines, cymbals. 30,000 people celebrating. The ark finally moving after 20 years of silence. Everything felt right. And then they reached the threshing floor of Nacon. The oxen stumbled, the cart tilted, the ark swayed, and Uzzah did the most natural, most instinctive, most humanly understandable thing in the world. He reached out his hand to steady the ark so it would not fall. 2 Samuel chapter 6 records what happened next in a single sentence. The anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his irreverence, and he died right there beside the ark. He died instantly for holding the ark steady, for preventing it from hitting the ground, for doing exactly what any person would do by reflex. The music stopped. 30,000 people froze, and David, the man who had faced Goliath and survived years as a fugitive, became furious, and then immediately afraid. His exact words, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" He had seen what happened at Beth Shemesh. He knew the history of the Philistine cities. He knew about Eli's sons dead on the battlefield. And now before his own eyes, a man he likely knew personally, a man doing something apparently good, lay dead on the ground. David called off the operation. The ark would not go to Jerusalem. Not that day. He diverted it to the house of a man named Obed-Edom, a Gittite, and the ark stayed there for 3 months. And here the text does something completely unexpected. Instead of more death, instead of plague, 2 Samuel records simply that the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. Blessed. The same ark that had killed Uzzah, devastated 5 Philistine cities, and slaughtered the men of Beth Shemesh, brought blessing to the household of Obed-Edom. The question is inevitable. Why? What did Obed-Edom do that Uzzah did not? What was the difference? David spent those 3 months studying. He went back to the original instructions, and he found his error. 1 Chronicles records his own words. "Because you Levites did not carry the ark the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us. We did not seek him according to the prescribed way." The prescribed way. The instructions given to Moses on Sinai, written in detail in the book of Numbers. The ark was to be carried by Levites from the family of Kohath, on poles, on their shoulders, never touched directly, never placed on a cart. And what had David done? He had copied the method of the Philistines. He had used a cart pulled by oxen, exactly as the pagans had returned it. It worked for the Philistines because they had no instructions. They could not be held responsible for rules they had never been given. But Israel knew, or should have known. And the difference between genuine ignorance and negligent carelessness was the difference between life and death when it came to the ark. 3 months later, David tried again. But everything was different. 1 Chronicles describes meticulous preparation. The Levites were summoned, organized by family. Every role covered. Singers, instrumentalists, gatekeepers. Every detail respected. And this time, after the Levites had taken just 6 steps with the ark on their shoulders, David stopped and offered a sacrifice. 6 steps. He waited. No one died. He understood. The presence is moving with us, not against us. And from that moment, David exploded. He danced before the ark with everything he had. The Hebrew word describes not a ceremonial movement, but violent, ecstatic spinning and jumping. He was wearing only a linen priestly garment, light and short. The king of Israel, the conqueror of Jerusalem, was semi-clothed, soaked in sweat, shouting in the middle of a public procession. And he did not care. When the ark finally entered Jerusalem and was placed inside the tent David had prepared for it, the king offered sacrifices and distributed food to every person present. Every man and woman of Israel received bread, meat, and raisin cakes from the king's own hand. But the arrival of the ark in Jerusalem came with a personal cost. David's wife Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched from a window as the king danced, and she despised him in her heart. When David returned home, she met him with cutting sarcasm. She said, "How glorious the king of Israel looked today, dancing in front of the servants' maids like a common fool." And David's answer is one of the most revealing speeches in the Bible about what it meant to be in the presence of the ark. He said, "I was dancing before the Lord, not for the people, not for appearances, before the Lord." And before the ark, there is no royal dignity. There is no hierarchy. There is no decorum. There is only the human response to the presence of God. And if that response is to jump and spin like a madman, then that is what you do. The text records that Michal had no children for the rest of her life. The consequence is noted without elaboration, without explanation. The dry weight of having despised what happened before the ark. David was never allowed to build the temple. God told him, "You have shed too much blood. Your son will build it." But David spent the rest of his life preparing everything so that his son could. 1 Chronicles records the scale of what David accumulated. 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, bronze and iron beyond measure, cedar wood without count, craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, artisans of every kind gathered before a single stone was cut. David did not live to see the temple, but he designed every detail. And according to 1 Chronicles, those plans came directly from God, just as the plans for the tabernacle had come to Moses. Solomon took over the construction. It took 7 years. The dimensions? Approximately 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. By modern standards, not enormous. A medium-sized church in any city could match those dimensions. But what those walls contained was something the ancient world had never seen. Every interior surface lined with cedar. No stone visible anywhere inside. And over the cedar, gold. The altar, gold. The walls, gold. The floor, gold. The doors, gold. 2 massive cherubim of olive wood, each with a wingspan of 15 feet, standing in the innermost room, covered in gold. Every hinge, every chain, every decorative detail, gold. Solomon's temple was a gold box inside a stone box, and inside the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, the most restricted space in the ancient world, there was only one object, a wooden box covered in gold, with 2 cherubim on the lid, containing 2 stone tablets written by the finger of God. The dedication ceremony is one of the most cinematic moments in the Old Testament. Solomon summoned every elder, every tribal leader, every head of every family in Israel. The priests carried the ark from David's tent into the temple. The number of animals sacrificed along the way was so enormous, the text says they could not be counted, literally could not be recorded. The priests brought the ark into the Holy of Holies and placed it beneath the wings of the giant cherubim. The carrying poles were so long, their ends could be seen from the outer room. And then 1 Kings records a detail that confirms both the continuity and the loss of what had come before. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone. The jar of manna was gone. Aaron's rod was gone. At some point during the turbulent centuries, perhaps during the Philistine capture, perhaps during the 20 years in Kiriath Jearim, those objects had disappeared. Only the law remained, the words written directly by God on stone at Sinai. And then, as the priests came out of the Holy of Holies, the cloud came. The same cloud that had descended on Sinai. The same presence that had traveled with Israel through 40 years of desert. It filled Solomon's temple with such density that 1 Kings says the priests could not stand. They could not continue their service. The presence was so physically overwhelming that trained, consecrated men had to leave the room. Solomon looked at the cloud consuming the interior and spoke. The Lord said he would dwell in thick darkness. Thick darkness, not radiant light. A darkness so concentrated it had weight. A darkness that pushed every human being out. The ark had found its home. After centuries of desert, temporary tents, private houses, captures and returns, it rested in a structure built exclusively for it, in the center of the most prosperous kingdom Israel had ever known. And there, for approximately 370 years, it stayed. In the silence of the Holy of Holies, in absolute darkness, visited by exactly one person once a year, the high priest on the Day of Atonement, who entered with blood, with incense, and with fear. Solomon died around 930 BC. The Babylonians destroyed the temple in 586 BC. That is a window of approximately 344 years. At some point within that window, the most important object in the history of Israel simply ceased to appear in any record. And the most disturbing thing about the disappearance of the ark is not that it vanished. It is that almost no one in the biblical text seems to register the moment it happened. There is no alarm, no mourning, no account of where it went. The silence is deafening. But before we examine the theories of what happened, we need to understand the condition Israel was in during those 3.5 centuries. Because the context tells us a great deal. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took the throne, and immediately, catastrophically, he did everything wrong. The northern tribes came asking for relief from the crushing taxation Solomon had imposed to fund his building projects. Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served Solomon. They said, "Be moderate, listen to them, earn their loyalty." He consulted the young men who had grown up with him. They said, "Hit them harder." Rehoboam chose the young men. His exact words, recorded in 1 Kings, "My father made your yoke heavy, and I will make it heavier still. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." 10 of the 12 tribes broke away. The kingdom split. The northern kingdom of Israel took 10 tribes. The southern kingdom of Judah kept 2. And the ark remained in Jerusalem, in the temple, in the south. The northern kingdom never had access to it again. Jeroboam, the first king of the north, immediately built 2 golden calves, one in the far north and one in the south of his territory, and told the people, "These are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." The exact same words Aaron had used in the desert at Sinai when he built the golden calf. As if history were stuck in a loop. Meanwhile, in the south, things were not much better. Just 5 years after Solomon's death, Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt invaded Jerusalem. 1 Kings records that he took the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's palace. He took everything. But the text does not mention the ark among the things taken. This absence likely means either the ark was not taken, or Shishak did not penetrate the Holy of Holies, or he entered the darkness and chose not to touch what was inside. What followed over the next 2 centuries was a succession of kings in Judah alternating between faithfulness and apostasy. And some of them did things inside the temple that strain comprehension. King Ahaz, who ruled around 735 BC, visited Damascus, saw a pagan altar he liked, had a copy made, and installed it inside Solomon's temple. He moved the original bronze altar to the side. And 2 Chronicles records something even more extreme. Ahaz shut the doors of the house of the Lord. He closed the temple entirely. No worship, no sacrifice. The doors of the room where the ark rested, locked by the king of Judah himself. But Manasseh was worse. Manasseh reigned for 55 years, the longest reign of any king of Judah. And during most of it, he transformed the temple into something Solomon would not have recognized. He built altars for Baal inside the temple complex. He erected an Asherah pole, a Canaanite pagan idol, inside the house of the Lord. He built altars to the celestial bodies in both courts of the temple. He practiced divination and consulted mediums. He burned his own son as a human sacrifice. And 2 Kings says Manasseh shed so much innocent blood in Jerusalem that it filled the city from one end to the other. Now consider what this means for the ark. The most holy object in all of Israel was resting in the Holy of Holies, a few meters away from burning altars to Baal, and a carved idol placed inside God's own house. It is during this period that many scholars believe the ark was removed. Not by invaders, not by enemies, by faithful priests. Men who saw what was happening inside the temple and made a decision. The ark needed to be protected, not from foreign armies, but from the king of Israel himself. This theory gains considerable weight when we examine what happened next. The last good king of Judah was Josiah. He took the throne at 8 years old and launched the most thorough religious reform in the history of the southern kingdom. He purified the temple, destroyed the pagan altars, burned the Asherah poles, demolished the high places where idol worship had been practiced. And in the middle of this reform, in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 3, a single phrase appears that may be the most important clue about the fate of the ark. Josiah said to the Levites, "Put the holy ark in the house that Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, built." Put the ark in the house. This means the ark was not in the house. When Josiah issued that command, the ark was somewhere else. It had been removed. At some point, almost certainly during Manasseh's reign, someone had taken it out of the Holy of Holies. The question is where it was taken, and why, and whether it was ever truly returned. There are 4 main theories about what ultimately happened to the ark. Each has evidence, each has defenders, and each has serious problems. The first is the underground theory. The Temple Mount is not a solid rock. It is a geological formation riddled with natural caves, tunnels, cisterns, and underground passages. Some of these predate Solomon's temple entirely. Jewish tradition, preserved in the Talmud, in the tractate Yoma, states that there were secret chambers beneath the temple. And the rabbinic tradition, dating to the Second Temple period, states that King Josiah, knowing the temple would one day fall, hid the ark in one of those underground chambers. The Babylonian Talmud specifically discusses this hiding. In 1981, a rabbi responsible for the Western Wall area found what he believed was a passage leading directly under the Temple Mount. Workers began to clear the way. Within hours, the Islamic religious authority that manages the site, sealed the passage with concrete. To this day, no one knows what was on the other side. The obvious obstacle to this theory is that the Temple Mount is today one of the most politically contested places on Earth. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stand above it. Any attempt at archaeological excavation beneath the site is politically impossible. Every serious attempt has triggered diplomatic crisis. The second theory is the oldest and most elaborate. It is the Ethiopian tradition. And it does not say the Ark disappeared. It says the Ark was taken to Ethiopia, and that it is there today. The text behind this tradition is the Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopian manuscript compiled in the 14th century, which tells the story of the Queen of Sheba, her visit to Solomon, and the son born from that encounter. The Queen of Sheba, called Makeda in Ethiopian tradition, traveled to Jerusalem to test Solomon's wisdom. The Bible confirms this meeting in 1 Kings chapter 10. But the Kebra Nagast adds what the Bible does not record. Solomon and Makeda had a son named Menelik. Menelik grew up in Ethiopia, later traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father, and when he returned to Ethiopia, he or his companions took the ark with them. According to this tradition, the ark traveled from Jerusalem to Ethiopia via Egypt, and came to rest in the ancient capital of Aksum. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that it is still there today. In a small chapel attached to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, in northern Ethiopia, guarded by a single monk, a man chosen for life for this one purpose. He never leaves the chapel complex. He lives there until he dies. Before dying, he names his successor. No scholar, no archaeologist, no head of state has ever been permitted to see what is inside that chapel. No photographs, no film, no scientific analysis. The guardian simply says, "It is here." For Ethiopia, this is not an archaeological question. It is a matter of faith. Ethiopian civilization, in many ways, was built around the belief that the Ark has been in their care for 3,000 years. Every one of Ethiopia's more than 35,000 Orthodox churches has a replica of the Ark, called a tablet, inside it. The tablet is the most sacred object of each church, visible only to priests. But the Ethiopian theory faces serious historical problems. The Kebra Nagast was compiled 14 centuries after the events it describes. There is no reference to the transfer of the Ark to Ethiopia in any Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, or biblical source from the relevant period. And the chronology creates contradictions. If Menelik took the Ark during Solomon's reign, how was it still in the temple when Pharaoh Shishak invaded decades later? How did Josiah order the Ark returned to the temple centuries afterward, if it had already been in Ethiopia for generations? Defenders of the theory propose various answers. Some suggest a copy remained in Jerusalem. Others propose alternative timelines. But for most academic historians, the Ethiopian tradition reflects national theology more than verified history. The third theory is the most painful. It says the Ark was simply destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar burned Jerusalem in 586 BC. 2 Kings describes the Babylonian destruction in meticulous detail. The bronze pillars of the temple, broken. The bronze stands, broken. The bronze basin, broken. Every gold and silver object of the temple, carried off to Babylon. Every utilitarian item, pots, shovels, snuffers, basins, listed individually among the spoils. And then the temple was burned. But the Ark of the Covenant does not appear on any list. Not among the spoils taken to Babylon, not among the objects destroyed. It is simply not mentioned. This silence admits two opposite interpretations. First, the Ark is absent from the list because it was no longer in the temple when the Babylonians arrived. It had already been removed, hidden, or transferred. Second, the Ark is absent because it was destroyed along with everything else, and a Babylonian military report had no reason to specifically note a wooden object covered in gold belonging to a conquered religion. The gold was melted and taken, the wood burned. End of story. For many historians, this is the simplest and most likely explanation, consistent with ancient conquest practices. But there is a complication. When Cyrus, king of Persia, later conquered Babylon and permitted the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem, he ordered the temple vessels that had been taken to be returned. Ezra chapter 1 records this list in specific detail. Gold platters, gold bowls, silver bowls, and nearly 5,400 items in total. The list is meticulous, but the ark is not on it. If the Babylonians had carried the ark to Babylon as plunder, it should have been among the items Cyrus returned. It was not, which suggests one of two things. Either it was melted down and therefore not identifiable as the ark, or it was never in Babylon, because it was never in the temple when the Babylonians arrived. The fourth theory comes from the second book of Maccabees, chapter 2, a text that Protestants classify as apocryphal, Catholics as deuterocanonical, and historians as, at the very least, intriguing. According to this account, the prophet Jeremiah, who was alive and active in Jerusalem during the final years before the Babylonian destruction, received a divine command and acted on it. He took the tabernacle, the ark, and the altar of incense, and traveled to Mount Nebo in present-day Jordan, the same mountain where Moses had stood to see the promised land before he died. He found a cave. He placed the objects inside. He sealed the entrance. Some of those with him tried to mark the location so they could return for it. Jeremiah rebuked them. And he said something that may be the most loaded sentence in all of this entire story. The place shall remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things. According to this tradition, the ark is not lost. It is kept. Hidden not by stones and dirt, but by divine intention. It will not be found by any expedition. It will only be revealed when God decides the time has come. 4 theories. Under the Temple Mount. In Ethiopia. Destroyed by the Babylonians. Hidden by Jeremiah on Mount Nebo. None of them can be proven. None of them can be definitively ruled out. When the Jewish exiles returned from Babylon and rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt everything: the altar, the courtyards, the holy place, the Holy of Holies. But the Holy of Holies of the Second Temple was empty. No ark, no cherubim, no mercy seat. The most sacred room in the most sacred place in the world was a bare stone cube. The Talmud confirms this explicitly. The tractate Yoma lists 5 things present in the first temple that were absent in the second: the ark, the sacred fire, the Shekinah, the visible presence of God, the Holy Spirit dwelling in a manifest way, and the Urim and Thummim, the priestly instruments of divine guidance. 5 absences. And the first on the list is the ark. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest of the Second Temple entered the Holy of Holies and sprinkled blood, not on the mercy seat, because there was no mercy seat. He sprinkled it on the bare stone floor, on the exact spot where the ark had once rested. The high priest performed the most sacred ritual of the year before a void. He acted out the ceremony for an object that was not there. This is a detail of extraordinary historical and theological weight. And yet the Second Temple was not considered a lesser temple. Herod the Great, who ruled during the time of Jesus, spent 46 years and incalculable resources transforming it into one of the most impressive structures of the ancient world. The outer walls were built from stones weighing up to 500 tons each. The courtyard could hold hundreds of thousands of people. The doors were covered in gold and silver. Seen from a distance, the entire structure looked like a mountain of snow crowned with gold. White marble walls, gold roof plates reflecting the desert sun with such intensity that the historian Josephus says observers were forced to look away. It was the greatest architectural project in the region, and at its heart, in the most protected room of this magnificent structure, there was nothing. An empty space, a stone on the floor, and the memory of something that had been there and was no longer. The Jewish people continued anyway. They continued offering sacrifices. They continued observing the Day of Atonement. They continued treating that empty space as the most sacred location on earth. And that choice, that act of continuing in the absence of the object, reveals something profound about the nature of faith. It does not require the visible thing. The absence of the ark did not end the relationship, or at least that is what the faithful chose to believe. After the Romans destroyed Herod's temple in 70 AD, the search for the ark became something different. It stopped being a matter of priests protecting a sacred object. It became an obsession that crossed entire civilizations. The Arch of Titus, which still stands today in Rome near the Colosseum, shows in carved relief the spoils of the temple being carried in triumph through Rome. You can see the great seven-branched menorah being carried by Roman soldiers, the table of showbread, silver trumpets. But the ark does not appear. If the Romans had found the ark, they would have displayed it. Its reputation extended far beyond the borders of Israel. Everyone in the ancient world knew what it was. The most likely conclusion is that by 70 AD, when Titus destroyed the temple, the ark had already been absent for centuries. It was an absence within an absence. The Knights Templar, the Christian military order founded in 1119 AD, established their headquarters directly over the Temple Mount. 9 founding knights, living and working above the ruins of Solomon's temple for 9 years. The official purpose was protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. But a persistent theory, documented since the 19th century, states that the Templars were actually excavating, looking for something underneath the Temple Mount. In 1867, a British engineering team mapping tunnels beneath the site found evidence of medieval excavation. Templar tools were found in the tunnels. The knights had been down there. What they found, if anything, has never been established. In 1911, a group funded by British investors attempted a secret excavation under the Temple Mount at night, bribing Ottoman guards for access. When local residents discovered that foreigners were digging beneath the sacred site, violent riots broke out in Jerusalem. The team fled the country. They found nothing. In the 20th century, the most famous and most problematic figure in popular biblical archaeology was a man named Ron Wyatt, an anesthetist from Nashville with no academic archaeological training. Between the 1970s and 1990s, he claimed to have found an astonishing number of biblical relics. Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, Pharaoh's chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea, the site of Sodom and Gomorrah, and, in 1982, the Ark of the Covenant. According to Wyatt, he found it in an underground chamber beneath the site of the crucifixion outside Jerusalem's old city walls. He claimed the ark was positioned directly below where Jesus had been crucified, and that through a crack in the rock, the blood from the cross had dripped down onto the mercy seat. He claimed to have collected blood samples, which he said laboratory analysis showed contained only 24 chromosomes, with no human paternal contribution. The scientific and archaeological community rejected every one of these claims entirely. No laboratory confirmed the test results. No professional archaeologist verified the chamber. The Israeli Antiquities Authority stated there was no evidence for any of Wyatt's discoveries. He remains a polarizing figure, a hero to some, a fraud to others, and a cautionary example to all of what desperation to confirm belief can produce. In 2008, a British researcher proposed that a sacred ritual object of the Lemba people of Zimbabwe, called the Ngoma Lungundu, was a direct descendant of the Ark. Carbon dating placed the object at around 600 years old. Ancient, but not ancient enough. However, genetic testing of the Lemba people revealed something unexpected and genuinely remarkable. A significant proportion of Lemba men carry a genetic marker associated with the Jewish priestly lineage, the Kohanim. There was a real historical connection between the Lemba and ancient Israel. The link to the Ark itself remained speculative, but the genetic discovery was real, and it expanded the boundaries of what serious researchers were willing to consider. Among all the documents that might hold a clue to the location of the Ark, one stands apart from every other, and surprisingly few people outside of academia know it exists. It is called the Copper Scroll. Found in 1952 in Cave 3 at Qumran, alongside the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Every other manuscript found at Qumran was written on parchment or papyrus. This one was different. It was a thin sheet of copper, oxidized and brittle, which had to be physically cut into strips just to be read. And while every other Qumran document contained religious texts, biblical books, community rules, hymns, or prophecies, the Copper Scroll contained something completely different: a list of treasure locations. 64 locations across the Judean region where supposedly enormous quantities of gold and silver had been hidden. The amounts listed are staggering. Tons upon tons of precious metal. More than the entire known economy of ancient Judea could reasonably have produced. Many researchers, therefore, dismiss the Copper Scroll as fantasy, a folk legend, a fictional account of imaginary riches. But other researchers took it seriously. Israeli scholar Benjamin Mazar argued that the quantities, though enormous, were consistent with centuries of accumulated temple treasure. And if the Copper Scroll was a real record, it meant that someone, possibly temple priests, possibly the Qumran community, had documented where the sacred objects of the Jerusalem temple had been hidden before the Roman destruction. The first entry on the list is fragmentary, and its translation is debated. But some scholars read it as a reference to a sacred object hidden in a sealed location. It is not explicitly called the Ark, but the possibility is enough to have generated decades of scholarly attention. The problem is that the location descriptions in the Copper Scroll are almost impossible to follow today. They say things like, in the cistern under the east wall, in a hole in the rock. Which cistern? Which east wall? The landmarks that were self-evident to whoever wrote them 2,000 years ago are nearly insoluble enigmas now. The landscape has changed. Walls were destroyed and rebuilt. Cisterns were filled. Paths were erased. It is like trying to follow a treasure map written in a language no one fully speaks anymore. And this brings us to a reflection that is rarely made about the Ark, but which may be the most important of all. The impossibility of finding it may not be an accident. It may be the point. Think about what the Ark was by design. The most restricted object in the ancient world. No one could touch it. No one could look at it directly. Only one person, once a year, could be in the same room as it. And even then, he stood behind a cloud of incense so thick that he could not see the mercy seat. The Ark existed to be inaccessible. Its function was to mark the limit, the exact boundary where the human could advance no further. And what happened to it? It became completely inaccessible. Not behind a veil anymore, behind time. Not guarded by golden cherubim, guarded by 25 centuries of silence. If the Ark was designed to be the threshold between the human and the divine, then its disappearance is the logical extension of its own nature. It did not get lost. It withdrew. It moved to where it had always belonged, beyond the reach of human hands. There is a passage in the Talmud, in the tractate Yuma, that describes something that happened in the Jerusalem temple during the great pilgrimage festivals. 3 times a year, Jews from across the ancient world came to Jerusalem. And according to the Talmud, on those occasions, the priests would lift the veil of the Holy of Holies and show the people the cherubim on the Ark. And the cherubim were intertwined with each other, face to face, embracing. And the priests would say, "See how God's love for you is like the love of a man for a woman." It is an image that should stop anyone in their tracks. The most terrifying object in the ancient world, the ark that killed Uzzah, that devastated 5 cities, that decimated Beth Shemesh, was also the ark whose cherubim embraced each other face to face. Terror and tenderness, infinite distance and absolute closeness, all in the same object. And perhaps that is why the ark captures human imagination in a way nothing else from the ancient world can match. It is not the gold, it is not the mystery, it is what it represents. The possibility that the distance between the human and the divine is not infinite, that there is a meeting point, that the gap can be crossed. In the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, something extraordinary appears. The temple of God in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. The ark that vanished from earth appears in heaven, not found in a cave, not unearthed by archaeologists, revealed in the heavenly temple, of which, according to the biblical writer, the earthly temple was only ever a copy. For many Christian theologians, this passage settles the question in a way no excavation could. The physical ark was always a shadow of something that existed before it in the celestial realm. And what that shadow pointed toward, according to Christian understanding, was not another object, it was a person. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14, says, "The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us." The Greek word used, eskenosin, literally means tabernacled, dwelt in a tent, the same image as the tabernacle in the desert. God choosing to dwell among his people, no longer in a box covered in gold, but in a human body. In Jewish tradition, the disappearance of the ark was not the end of God's presence. The rabbinic tradition that emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD made something radical. The Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, states, "When 10 people gather to pray, the Shekinah is among them, not in a gold box, among people." The synagogue replaced the temple. The Torah scroll replaced the ark. The Holy of Holies, accessible only to one man once a year, became something anyone could enter at any moment. Prayer. A theological revolution so profound it reshaped the entire history of religion. In Islam, the ark, called Tabut al-Sakina in the Quran, has a prophetic dimension as well. The Quran mentions it in Surah al-Baqarah as a sign of divine legitimacy. And later Islamic traditions associate its reappearance with end-time events. 3 religions, 3 billion people. And for all of them, the ark is not a closed chapter. It is an open one, an unresolved question, a presence that became an absence, and that the faith of billions believes will one day become a presence again. There is one more question that almost no one asks, and it may be the most disturbing one of all. What would actually happen if someone found the ark tomorrow? Not in theory, in practice. Imagine an archaeologist breaks through a stone wall in a cave beneath Jerusalem and finds a wooden box covered in gold with 2 golden cherubim on its lid. Carbon-14 dating on the wood gives a date consistent with the 13th century BC. Metallurgical analysis of the gold is consistent with ancient Egyptian techniques. Every test confirms it. What happens the next morning? The honest answer is chaos. First, the political crisis. If the ark were found under the Temple Mount, in one of the most contested territories on earth, who would have legal claim to it? The modern state of Israel as heir to ancient Judean civilization. The Palestinian Authority, representing the Muslims who have administered the Haram al-Sharif for centuries. Jordan, which holds legal custodial rights over Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem. Or the international community, on the grounds that an artifact of this magnitude belongs to all of humanity. The United Nations would convene emergency sessions. Every government with a stake in Middle Eastern stability would mobilize diplomatically. Demonstrations would erupt simultaneously in Jerusalem, Cairo, Amman, Istanbul, and dozens of other cities. The discovery of a wooden and gold box could become the trigger for a regional crisis. Then the religious implications. For Judaism, the discovery would not simply be a major archaeological event. It would be a theological event of messianic proportions. There are movements within Judaism that believe the rebuilding of the Third Temple and the return of the Ark to the Holy of Holies is a prerequisite for the coming of the Messiah. Organizations like the Temple Institute in Jerusalem have already reconstructed more than 70 of the sacred vessels required for temple service. The high priestly vestments, made. The breastplate with the 12 stones, made. Men of the priestly lineage identified through DNA analysis, identified. Priests trained in sacrifice rituals, prepared. Everything is ready, according to them, except two things: the location, currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock, and the Ark. If the Ark were found, the pressure to rebuild the temple would become overwhelming for a significant portion of the Jewish world. And rebuilding the temple would mean building on or beside the third holiest site in Islam. The implications are almost too large to contemplate. For Christianity, the discovery would raise equally profound theological questions. If the Ark still exists as a physical object, what does that mean for the Christian understanding that the Old Covenant, with its rituals and sacred objects, was fulfilled and transcended? For Islam, finding the Ark beneath an Islamic holy site would create a tension between reverence for the object and protection of sacred territory, unlike anything in the history of that tradition. And beneath all the politics and all the theology, there would come the quietest question of all, the personal one. If the Ark were found and verified, what would it mean for you? If you already believe in God, would it confirm anything you did not already believe? And if you do not believe, would an ancient object of wood and gold change that? Or would it only prove that ancient people believed intensely enough to build extraordinary things? There is a crucial distinction between the existence of the sacred and the existence of the belief in the sacred. And perhaps the Ark is so powerful precisely because it lives in that space between the two. Found, it would become an exhibit, protected behind bulletproof glass, photographed, documented, analyzed. And within a year, humanity would move on. Because that is what we do with resolved mysteries. We consume them and continue. But an unresolved mystery stays. It works inside us. It wakes us at 3 a.m. The lost Ark may be infinitely more powerful than the found Ark would ever be, because the lost Ark is an open question, and open questions are the fuel of the human soul. The story of the Ark of the Covenant is not, at its core, a story about an object. It is a story about a question, the oldest question human beings have ever asked, reformulated in acacia wood and beaten gold. Is there something beyond what we can see and touch? And if there is, can we reach it? Every civilization has tried to answer this in its own way. The Sumerians built ziggurats, stairways to heaven. The Egyptians built pyramids, ascension machines for the soul. The Greeks had Olympus. The Hindus had Mount Meru. Each culture, in its own way, built a place where the divine might descend and the human might ascend. The Ark was Israel's version of that universal impulse, but with one radical difference. In every other tradition, the contact point was fixed, a mountain, a temple, a geographic location that did not move. But the Ark moved. It traveled across the desert. It crossed the Jordan River. It circled Jericho. It went from Gilgal to Shiloh, from Shiloh to the battlefield, from the battlefield to Philistia, from Philistia to Beth Shemesh, from Beth Shemesh to Kiriath Jearim. and from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. God's presence in the Israelite understanding was not tied to a place. It was tied to a people. It went where they went. It stopped where they stopped. And when the ark finally rested in Solomon's temple, it was not because God needed a house. It was because the people needed a center. And when the ark disappeared, the idea it carried did not disappear with it. It transformed. The trajectory over the centuries is clear. First, God dwelt in a box carried by 4 men. Then, in a room inside a building. Then, among any gathering of people who called on his name. Then, in the Christian understanding, inside each individual person. The direction is always the same, from the smaller to the larger, from the exclusive to the universal, from the physical to the spiritual. The ark, in this sense, was not lost. It was transcended. 3,300 years ago, in the Sinai desert, at the foot of a burning mountain, an artisan named Bezalel took a piece of acacia wood and began to shape the most impossible thing the world had ever seen: a house for the infinite. He did not know if it would work. He did not know if God would truly dwell there. He did not know if he was building the most sacred object in history or simply an empty box covered in gold. But he built it anyway, because the alternative, not trying, was worse than any failure. And here we are, 3 millennia later, still searching, still building, still trying. Every telescope pointed at the stars is a modern version of that impulse. Every equation written to describe the invisible structure of the universe is an act of faith. Faith that the mystery has order. Faith that the unknown has a shape. The language has changed. The instruments have changed. But the direction is the same. Upward. Inward. Beyond. Always beyond. And as long as there is a human being asking a question they cannot yet answer, the Ark of the Covenant remains alive. Not in a cave in Ethiopia, not under the Temple Mount, in the asking, in the searching, in the refusal to accept that the silence is the final word. The Ark was the testimony of one conviction above all others: that the sacred exists, that it can be found, and that it is worth dedicating an entire life to looking for it. Wherever the ark is, it continues to point in one direction, and the direction has not changed.